The October morning was cold and still. The cemetery sat on the edge of the city, away from the noise of traffic and the hum of office buildings, and at that hour the only sounds were the wind moving through the rows of ginkgo trees and the quiet sobbing of a woman somewhere behind the crowd. Calm Juno stood at the front of the gathered mourners, close enough to the grave that the freshly turned earth was visible beneath the white floral arrangements. The coffin was pale birch wood. He had chosen it himself. She had always said she loved natural things, unpainted, unvarnished, honest. So he had chosen the plainest one, and he had filled it with white chrysanthemums because those were the flowers she kept in a small vase on her desk every single week without exception. Her name was Yoon Soo-jin. She was 34 years old. She died quietly in her sleep 4 days ago, a congenital heart valve defect that no doctor had caught in time, or perhaps ever looked for seriously enough. Juno had been sitting beside her when she stopped breathing. He had held her hand for a long time before calling anyone. There was nothing dramatic about it. She simply went. And now she was in the ground, and the sky above the cemetery was the flat, pale gray of early autumn, and Juno stood with his hands at his sides and his face completely still. The mourners were many. Park Sung-go, his father-in-law, had made sure of that. He had sent notices to every business partner, every shareholder, every city official who had ever attended a dinner at the Park family estate. The funeral was large and properly arranged, the kind of event that communicated wealth and order and dignity. Juno had said nothing about the arrangements. He had let Sung-go handle everything because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because he had not had the energy to argue about flowers and catering and the precise order of the ceremony when the only thing in his mind was the image of Soo-jin's face in those last quiet hours. Sung-go stood on the other side of the grave. 72 years old, silver-haired, spine as straight as a man half his age, dressed in a black suit that had no wrinkles and never seemed to acquire any. Juno had known him for 10 years. Had worked under him, beside him, for him. Had called him father, though Sung-go had never quite made him feel that the word was returned. There had always been a precise and careful distance between them, a distance that Sung-go maintained the way he maintained everything in his life, with deliberate, controlled intention. Juno had told himself over the years that it was simply the man's character. That it did not mean anything about how he was regarded. He had told himself that many times. After the earth was placed over the coffin and the flowers had been laid and the ceremony had concluded, the crowd began to separate into small clusters of people exchanging quiet words and bowing to each other. Juno stood alone for a moment. Someone touched his elbow, a colleague, offering condolences, and he nodded and thanked the man without registering his face. Then Park Sung-go walked toward him. The older man moved through the crowd and people parted for him without him asking, the way they always did. He stopped in front of Juno and looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read. It was not grief exactly. It was something more composed than grief, something that had already processed whatever it needed to process and arrived at a conclusion. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a white envelope and held it out. Juno took it automatically. He assumed it was something administrative, perhaps a document related to Soo-jin's personal affairs, something that needed his signature. He almost put it in his pocket without opening it. But something about the way Sung-go was watching him made him pause. There was a tension in the older man's eyes, a focused, waiting quality, like someone observing the result of an experiment they had already designed. Juno opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, printed on company letterhead. He read the first line. Then he read it again. Official notice of employment termination, effective immediately, citing restructuring of executive positions following internal review. Signed by Park Sung-go in his capacity as chairman and founder of PS Holdings. Dated the same day as the funeral. Juno folded the letter carefully along its original crease. He placed it back in the envelope. He put the envelope in the pocket of his jacket. Around him the mourners were still speaking in low voices, still moving between each other with their bowed heads and their careful expressions. Nobody had seen the exchange. Or perhaps some had. Either way, nobody spoke. Juno looked at his father-in-law. Sung-go met his gaze without flinching. For 10 years Juno had made this man's company profitable. Had rebuilt its supply chain after the 2017 crisis. Had negotiated the Busan contract that doubled their southern market share. had stayed in the office until 2 in the morning more times than he could count while Sungo attended dinners and gave speeches and received awards for leadership that Juno had quietly enabled from behind every closed door. And now, at the grave of the man's own daughter, on the day of the funeral, he had handed him a termination letter. Juno did not feel anger. That surprised him slightly. He had expected anger and found instead something that was almost like clarity, a sudden clean silence where the noise of 10 years of effort and patience and swallowed frustration had been. He looked at Sungo for a long moment. Then, very slowly, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile. Something smaller and more precise than a smile. A recognition. Sungo's eyes shifted for just a fraction of a second, and in that fraction Juno saw something he had never seen in that face before. Uncertainty. It lasted only a moment before the composed mask returned. Sungo turned and walked away toward the waiting cars. Juno stood at the grave a little longer, alone. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the edge of the envelope. Sujin's chrysanthemums were white against the dark earth. Somewhere behind him a phone buzzed. He did not reach for it. There was no hurry. He had been patient for 10 years, and whatever came next, he already knew that Sungo had made a mistake today. Not because of the letter. Because of the timing. Because a man who fires his son-in-law at his daughter's funeral believes the son-in-law has nothing left to fight with. And that belief, Juno understood, standing quietly in the cold October air, was the first and most important miscalculation Park Sungo had ever made about him. 10 years ago Kong Juno was 28 years old and owned almost nothing. He had a small rented room on the 4th floor of a building in Mapo district where the pipes knocked in winter and the ceiling held a permanent brown stain above the bed that the landlord had promised to fix for 2 years. He had a second-hand laptop, a certificate from Yonsei University's engineering department, and a thesis on polymer-based manufacturing process optimization that his professor had described as genuinely exceptional work with unfortunately limited commercial visibility. He had no connections, no family name that opened doors, no father who played golf with chairmen on weekends. What he had was a way of seeing problems that other people looked past, a patience for detail that most of his peers found exhausting, and the particular kind of hunger that belongs to people who understand very precisely how far they are from where they want to be. He had applied to 14 companies in 8 months. He had received 3 interviews and no offers. The manufacturing sector was contracting that year and everyone wanted experience he did not yet have and connections he did not yet possess. He was running low on money and beginning to understand, in the quiet and practical way that he understood most things, that he would need to find another angle. He met Yoon Soo-jin on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring at a small cafe near Hangik University where he had gone to use the Wi-Fi because his building's internet had been down for 3 days. She was sitting 2 tables away with a stack of documents and a cup of green tea gone cold and a look of concentrated irritation directed at whatever she was reading. She was wearing a gray coat and her hair was pulled back simply and she was not trying to be noticed, which was the first thing Juno registered about her, because most people in that cafe were performing some version of themselves for the room and she was entirely indifferent to the room. He would not have spoken to her except that her documents slid off the table when she reached for her cup and scattered across the floor and he was closer to them than she was so he collected them. She thanked him with the slightly distracted efficiency of someone whose attention is still mostly elsewhere. He glanced at the top page without meaning to and saw a supply chain audit for a mid-sized industrial materials company. He recognized the format. He had written something structurally similar for his thesis. He said so. She looked at him properly for the first time. They talked for 2 hours. He walked her to the subway station. She gave him her number without him asking, which surprised him. He thought about it for 3 days before sending a message. They dated for 8 months before she told him who her father was. She had not hidden it exactly, but she had not offered it either, and Juno later understood that she had learned to wait before sharing that particular piece of information because it changed the way people looked at her in ways she found exhausting. Park Sungo was the founder and chairman of PS Holdings, one of the mid-tier industrial manufacturing conglomerates that had survived the restructuring years by pivoting precisely and ruthlessly into specialized components. The company had around 400 employees, 3 regional facilities, and a reputation in the industry for operational discipline. When Juno met Sungo for the first time over dinner at the Park family home in Songbukdong, the older man had looked at him across the table with the same measuring expression that Juno would come to know across a decade of meetings. Sungo asked him about his thesis. Juno explained it clearly and without embellishment. Sungo asked 2 follow-up questions that were precise and technically informed. Then he changed the subject and spoke about something else and did not return to it. 2 weeks later, Sujin told Juno that her father had offered him a position at PS Holdings as a junior process engineer. The salary was modest. The title was unremarkable. Juno accepted. He understood from the first week that he was on a kind of probation that had no formal name. Sungo watched him the way a man watches a tool he is not yet sure is properly calibrated. The other engineers treated him with the careful neutrality reserved for people whose position in the hierarchy was ambiguous. He was the chairman's daughter's boyfriend, which meant he could not be dismissed casually, but he had produced nothing yet, which meant he could not be respected either. Juno ignored all of it and worked. He spent the first 3 months reading every process document the company had produced in the last decade. He mapped the inefficiencies in the southern facility's production line and presented a proposed solution to his direct manager, a careful man named Oh Dong-soo, who took the report upstairs without crediting Juno by name. The solution was implemented. Costs in that line dropped by 11% over the following quarter. Sungo noted this in a meeting without mentioning who had identified the problem. Juno said nothing. He went back to his desk and began working on the next thing. He married Sujin 2 years after joining the company, in a ceremony that Sungo organized with his characteristic precision and controlled generosity, and Juno became officially part of the family, which changed his title and his salary and his access to meetings but did not fundamentally change the temperature of the room when he and Sungo were in it alone. The distance remained. The measurement continued. Juno kept working. He rebuilt the supply chain after the 2018 component shortage crisis when 2 senior managers panicked and Sungo was traveling and no one else in the building seemed willing to make a decision. He made the decision. He worked for 60 hours without sleeping, and by the time Sungo returned the crisis had been contained. Sungo thanked him once, briefly, in a corridor. Then at the quarterly board presentation he described the crisis response as a testament to the company's leadership culture and its deep operational resilience. Juno's name was not mentioned. It was at that moment, standing at the back of the boardroom listening to Sungo receive the quiet approval of the directors, that Juno first did something he had not done before. After the meeting ended and the room cleared, he stayed behind and sat down alone at the long table. He opened his laptop. He pulled up a legal document he had been drafting quietly for several months in the margins of his other work. He read it through one final time. Then he signed it, saved it, and sent it to a lawyer whose office was in a building 3 blocks away and who had no connection to PS Holdings or the Park family. He closed the laptop and turned off the light and walked out. In the corridor the cleaners were already moving through with their carts. Nobody saw him leave. Nobody knew what he had just done. That was exactly how he intended it. Juno spent the first week after the funeral doing what needed to be done. He answered calls from lawyers about inheritance paperwork. He responded to messages from colleagues with brief and polite acknowledgments. He ate meals he did not taste and slept in fragments and woke each morning to the particular silence of an apartment that had been built around 2 people and now held only 1. Sujin's green tea was still in the cabinet. Her reading glasses were on the nightstand. Her coat was on the hook by the door. He had not moved any of it. He was not ready to make those decisions yet, and he did not force himself. He had always believed that there was a correct time for every action and that moving before that time produced nothing useful. So he waited and he processed and he worked through the practical matters one by one, and he did not allow himself to fall apart because falling apart was a luxury that the situation did not currently permit. On the 8th day after the funeral he went into the small room that Sujin had used as a home office. It was the room where she kept her books and her documents and the small potted plant she had never been able to keep alive for longer than 3 months before replacing it with an identical one. The current plant was beginning to yellow at the edges. Juno looked at it for a moment and then sat down at her desk and began to go through the drawers methodically. There were the things he expected: pens and notebooks and charging cables and a small box of business cards from people she had met at industry events. There were photographs from a trip they had taken to Jeju 4 years ago, tucked into a manila envelope without labels. There was a small notebook with her handwriting in it that he set aside to read later when he felt he could. And at the back of the bottom drawer, beneath a folded map of Seoul that had no reason to be there, was an envelope. white, sealed, with his name on the front in her handwriting. Beneath his name she had written 7 words. "Open this when father shows his true face." He sat with the envelope in his hands for a long time without opening it. The room was very quiet. Outside the window a delivery motorbike passed on the street below. He looked at her handwriting on the front of the envelope, the particular way she formed the K in his name with a slightly longer upper stroke than most people used, a detail he had noticed years ago and never mentioned. Then he opened it. The letter was 4 pages, written by hand, dated 7 months before her death. She began by saying that she was sorry. Not for what she was about to tell him but for not having told him sooner, and for the years of watching him work inside a system that was designed to use him without ever fully acknowledging him, and for the fact that she had understood what her father was doing long before she admitted it to herself. She wrote clearly and without excessive emotion, which was consistent with everything Juno knew about her. She explained that approximately 2 years ago she had overheard a conversation between her father and the company's chief financial officer, a man named Bae Hyun-seok, in which Sungo had spoken about the long-term plan for Juno's role at PS Holdings. The plan was not complicated. Juno would remain useful for as long as Sujin was alive, because removing him while she was alive would create a conflict that Sungo preferred to avoid. But Sungo had never considered Juno a permanent part of the company's leadership. He was a capable tool, in the older man's precise and unsentimental calculus, and tools were retained until they were no longer needed and then they were set aside. Sujin wrote that she had confronted her father about this conversation and that he had not denied it. He had explained it to her in the same tone he used to explain business decisions, measured and certain and entirely without apology. She had not told Juno at the time because she did not know how to tell him something that would confirm the thing she suspected he had always quietly feared but chosen not to examine. She wrote that she regretted this. She wrote that it was a failure of courage on her part and that he deserved better. Then she wrote about what she had done about it. This was the 3rd page of the letter and Juno's hands were very still as he read it. In the months after overhearing that conversation, Sujin had used her own access to the company's internal records, access she had as a shareholder and board observer, to quietly audit the financial movements that Bae Hyun-seok oversaw. What she found was irregular enough that she had consulted privately with an external financial forensics firm without telling her father. She had not completed the process before her health deteriorated. But she had documented what she had found up to that point and she had given those partial documents to someone she trusted inside the company, someone who had worked alongside Juno from the early years and who had never been part of Sungo's inner circle. She wrote the name at the bottom of the 3rd page. Juno read it and felt something shift in his chest. The name was Lim Jae-won. He had known Jae-won for 9 years. Had eaten lunch with him hundreds of times. Had trusted him instinctively in the way you trust someone whose consistency over years has made the trust feel like a simple fact. She had chosen well. On the 4th page Sujin wrote only a few lines. She said that she did not know exactly what form her father's move against Juno would take or precisely when it would come, but she knew it would come, and she wanted him to be ready rather than blindsided. She said she had done what she could with the time and the access she had. She said she believed in him completely and always had, from that Tuesday afternoon in the cafe when he had picked up her documents from the floor and looked at the top page with genuine interest rather than the polite blankness most people offered when they encountered something they did not understand. She said she was sorry she would not be there for the rest of it. She said she loved him. The letter ended there. Juno sat at her desk in the quiet room for a very long time. The yellowing plant was still on the shelf. Outside the window the street sounds continued, ordinary and indifferent to everything. He folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and held it. Then he reached for his phone and found Lim Jae-won's number and typed a single message. "We need to meet. Not at the office." His phone buzzed within 40 seconds. Jae-won's reply was 3 words. "I know." Tomorrow, the board meeting was held on a Thursday morning, 12 days after the funeral. Juno received the notification through the standard company channel, a calendar invitation with no additional notes, sent by Sungo's personal secretary. He was listed as an attendee, not a presenter, which was the first signal. For the past 6 years he had presented at every quarterly board session. His name had been on the agenda as a standing item. The fact that it was absent now was not an oversight. He accepted the invitation and said nothing and spent the 2 days before the meeting doing what he always did when he was preparing for something that required precision. He thought carefully, moved quietly, and allowed the other side to believe the situation was already resolved. The PS Holdings boardroom was on the 14th floor of the company's main building in Uedo. It had floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the Han River and a long oval table of dark wood that Sungo had commissioned from a furniture maker in Japan 20 years ago. Juno had sat at that table hundreds of times. He knew the particular way the morning light fell across it in October, the slight creak of the third chair from the left, the faint smell of the air conditioning system that maintenance had never fully resolved. He arrived early and took his usual seat and poured himself a glass of water and waited. The other directors arrived in the following minutes. He greeted each of them and received their greetings in return, and he noticed what he expected to notice: the careful neutrality of people who have been briefed on something and are waiting to see how it unfolds. They were not cold to him. They were precise. It was a different thing entirely. Park Sung-go entered last, which he always did, and took the chair at the head of the table, and the meeting began. The first 40 minutes were routine. Financial reports, operational updates from the regional facilities, a procurement proposal from the Incheon team. Juno listened and made notes and contributed twice when questions fell within his direct area, and his contributions were acknowledged with nods and no follow-up, which was another signal. Then Sungo set down his pen and looked around the table and said that he wanted to address a matter of internal structure before they moved to the final agenda items. His voice was the same as it always was, measured, authoritative, carrying the particular calm of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say and found it satisfactory. He explained that following a thorough internal review of the company's leadership needs in the current phase of its development, the executive team would be restructured to reflect a return to the founding operational model. He used that phrase, return to the founding operational model, and several of the directors nodded as if they recognized it from a prior conversation, which they almost certainly did. He said that the role of Chief Operations Officer, a role Juno had occupied formally for 4 years and functionally for several years before that, would be dissolved and its responsibilities redistributed among the existing senior management structure. He said that the company was grateful for the contributions of all those who had served in transitional capacities during its recent growth phase. He said the word transitional without emphasis, but it landed in the room like something deliberate, which it was. He did not say Juno's name. He did not look at him directly. He simply spoke about the restructuring in the third person, in the language of institutional decisions, and everyone at the table understood perfectly who he was talking about. Juno sat with his hands flat on the table and his face completely composed. He looked at Sungo as the older man spoke. Around the table the directors maintained their careful expressions. One of them, a man named Choi Byong-grak, who had been on the board for 15 years and who Juno had helped through a personal financial difficulty 7 years ago without ever mentioning it afterward, was looking at the surface of the table with particular intensity. Another director, the youngest one, a woman named Han Mayan who had joined the board 2 years ago and who Juno had always found straightforwardly decent, glanced at him once and then away. At the far end of the table, the chief financial officer Bae Hyun-seok was writing something in his notepad with the focused diligence of a man who very much wants to appear occupied. Then one of the outside directors, a heavy-set man named Kwon Sun-gil who had built his career in logistics and who had never particularly bothered to learn Juno's name correctly, leaned back in his chair and said with the satisfied tone of someone completing a thought they had been holding for a while, that it was good that these things were being handled properly and in a timely manner. That was the phrase he used. Timely manner. Juno looked at him. Kwon did not meet his eyes. Sungo asked if there were any questions about the restructuring. There were none. He moved to the next agenda item. Juno remained in his seat for the remainder of the meeting, which lasted another 20 minutes, and he participated where appropriate and his voice was steady and his contributions were clear. When the meeting ended, he stood and buttoned his jacket and exchanged brief words with 2 of the directors near the door and thanked Sungo's secretary for the meeting materials. Sungo himself did not speak to him directly. Juno walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby and stood inside the empty car as it descended. He looked at his reflection in the polished metal of the elevator doors. 14 floors. He counted them. When the doors opened, he walked through the lobby and nodded to the security guard at the front desk, a young man named Park Ji-hun who had started 6 months ago and who always greeted him with particular cheerfulness. He pushed through the glass doors into the October air. He stood on the pavement for a moment. Then he took out his phone and opened the message thread with Lin Jae-won and typed 4 words. It happened. Are you ready? He put the phone in his pocket and began walking. He did not look back at the building. There was nothing behind him worth looking at anymore. Lin Jae-won had worked at PS Holdings for 9 years. He had joined the company 1 year after Juno, through a standard recruitment process that had nothing to do with the Park family, and he had risen steadily through the engineering division on the basis of competence and a quality that Juno had always respected in him, which was that he understood the difference between loyalty to an institution and loyalty to the people who built it. He was 41 years old, unmarried, quiet in meetings but precise when he spoke, and he had a habit of arriving at the office before anyone else and leaving after most people had gone, not out of anxiety but out of a genuine preference for the building when it was empty and the work could proceed without interruption. Juno had trusted him for the better part of a decade. Sujin had trusted him too, which was a higher standard, because Sujin did not extend trust easily or quickly, and when she did it was based on observation rather than feeling. The fact that she had chosen Jae-won as the person to hold what she had found meant something specific, and Juno had not needed to think about it for long before understanding exactly what it meant. They met at a small restaurant in Mapo district, the same neighborhood where Juno had lived in his early years in the city, chosen for the practical reason that nobody from PS Holdings had any reason to be there on a weekday afternoon. Jae-won was already seated when Juno arrived, with a pot of barley tea on the table and an expression of careful steadiness that told Juno the man had been preparing for this conversation for longer than the past 12 days. They did not spend time on formalities. Jae-won reached into the bag beside his chair and produced a plain brown envelope and placed it on the table between them. Inside were printed copies of documents that Sujin had compiled before her health declined, partial financial records showing a series of irregular fund transfers from PS Holdings operational accounts into a private holding structure that was registered in a name Juno did not immediately recognize. Jae-won explained quietly that the name belonged to a company Bae Hyunseok had established 7 years ago through a nominee arrangement, and that the transfers had been occurring in small increments across that entire period, structured carefully enough to avoid triggering automatic audit flags but consistent enough that their pattern was visible once you knew to look for it. Sujin had known to look for it. Jae-won said she had been thorough and she had been careful, and what she had gathered was incomplete, but it was enough to make the direction of a full investigation entirely clear. Juno looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. Then he put them back in the envelope and asked Jae-won if there were copies in a secure location. Jae-won said there were 3 copies in 3 separate places and that none of them were in any location connected to PS Holdings or the Park family. Juno nodded and poured tea for both of them, and they sat for a moment in the ordinary noise of the restaurant. Then Juno told Jae-won about the patent. He had not told anyone about it before. Not Sujin, not Jae-won, not the lawyer who had filed it. He had maintained that silence for 8 years with the same discipline he applied to everything that mattered, because the value of the thing depended entirely on no one knowing it existed until the moment it needed to exist. He explained it plainly. In his 3rd year at PS Holdings, he had developed a manufacturing process optimization system that addressed a specific and persistent problem in the production of the specialized polymer components that were PS Holdings' primary commercial product. The system was not simply an improvement to an existing process. It was a genuinely novel approach that he had designed from the foundational level, drawing on the work he had done in his university thesis but extending it significantly, and it solved the problem in a way that no existing patent covered. He had documented it meticulously. He had filed the patent application personally, through the external lawyer in the building 3 blocks from the office, using his own name and not the company's name, because the work had been done on his own time, on his own equipment, developed from his own prior research, and he had been careful from the beginning to ensure that the legal boundary between his personal intellectual work and his employed duties was precisely and defensibly maintained. The patent had been granted 4 years ago. PS Holdings had been operating under an informal licensing arrangement that Juno had never formalized, never charged for, and never drawn anyone's attention to, because there had been no reason to until now. Without a formal license, the company's use of the process was legally exposed. Every unit of their primary product manufactured in the past 8 years had been produced using his system. Jae-won was quiet for a long moment after Juno finished speaking. Then he said, very carefully, that he needed to make sure he understood the situation correctly. Juno confirmed that he understood it correctly. Jae-won set down his cup and looked at the table and then looked up. He said that Park Sung-go had terminated Juno at his daughter's graveside without knowing that the man he was terminating held a patent that the entire commercial operation of his company depended on. Juno said that was an accurate summary. Jae-won was quiet again. Then he said something that Juno had not expected, which was that Soo-jin would have found this extremely satisfying. Juno looked at him. Jae-won's expression was not quite a smile, but it was something close to it, the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told it is nearly time to set it down. Juno felt something move in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. He thought it might be the closest thing to relief he had experienced in several weeks. He paid for the tea and they left separately, 10 minutes apart, as they had agreed before meeting. Walking back toward the subway station, Juno took out his phone and opened the contact for his lawyer, the one in the building 3 blocks from the office. He typed a message instructing him to prepare a formal notice of license termination for the manufacturing process patent, to be sent to PS Holdings at a date Juno would specify. He put the phone away. Above the street, the October sky was beginning to darken at the edges, the particular deep blue of early evening settling over the city from the east. Somewhere across Uedo, Park Sung-go was in his office or at a dinner or in a car, going through whatever remained of his Thursday, entirely unaware that the ground beneath everything he had built had just begun to move. The notice arrived at PS Holdings on a Monday morning, delivered through the company's legal intake channel, addressed to the office of the chairman and copied to the chief financial officer and the head of the legal department. It was a single page, formal in language, precise in its citations, and entirely unambiguous in its content. Kang Juno, as the registered holder of patent number KR10-2016-00873442 covering the polymer component manufacturing process optimization system, was providing formal notice of the termination of the informal licensing arrangement under which PS Holdings had been operating. The notice specified a transition period of 30 days, after which continued use of the patented process without a valid license agreement would constitute infringement. The letter was signed by Juno's lawyer. There was no personal note attached. There was no explanation beyond the legal language. There did not need to be one. Juno learned about the reaction inside the building through Jae-won, who was still employed there and who sent a single message at 11 that morning that said only, Hyunseok left his office 3 times in 1 hour. By afternoon, the company's legal department had pulled the patent registration records and confirmed what the notice claimed. By evening, Juno's phone had received 4 calls from numbers he did not recognize, which he did not answer, and 1 message from Sung-go's personal secretary asking whether Mr. Kang would be available for a meeting at his earliest convenience. Juno read the message and set the phone down and finished the bowl of rice he had been eating and washed the bowl and placed it on the drying rack. Then he picked up the phone and replied that he was available on Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon, at a location of his choosing, and provided the address of a small tea house in Insadong that he had visited occasionally with Soo-jin. He chose it deliberately. She had loved that place. The wooden floors and the paper screens and the smell of roasted green tea. It seemed appropriate that the conversation he was about to have should take place somewhere she had been comfortable. Park Sung-go arrived alone, which surprised Juno slightly. He had expected a lawyer or at minimum the secretary. But Sung-go came by himself, dressed in a charcoal suit, and he walked into the tea house with the same straight spine and measured step that he carried everywhere, as if the ground beneath him was always exactly as solid as he required it to be. Juno was already seated at a low table near the window. He had ordered tea. He stood briefly as Sung-go approached and gestured to the cushion across the table. Sung-go sat. For a moment neither of them spoke. The tea house was quiet at that hour, only 2 other tables occupied, both far enough away that conversation at normal volume was private. A young woman brought a second cup and filled it without being asked. Sung-go looked at the cup and then at Juno. Juno looked back and waited. Sung-go began by saying that he assumed Juno understood the disruption the notice had caused. His tone was the same as it always was, controlled and direct, but beneath it there was something that Juno had never heard there before, a very slight compression, the sound of a man choosing his words with more care than usual because the usual margin of comfort was no longer available. Juno said that he understood the notice was clear in its content and that disruption was a natural consequence of legal process. Sung-go looked at him for a moment. Then he said that he wanted to resolve the matter practically and that he was prepared to make a substantial offer for the outright purchase of the patent. He named a figure. It was large enough that most people in most circumstances would have required a moment to absorb it. Juno poured tea into his own cup, took a sip, and set the cup down. He said that he was not interested in selling. Sungo said that the figure was negotiable and that he was prepared to go significantly higher. Juno said that the amount was not the issue. Sungo was quiet for a moment. He asked what the issue was. Juno looked at him directly and said, quietly and without any particular emphasis, that the issue was that Sungo had handed him a termination letter at his daughter's funeral, and that whatever the letter was intended to communicate, what it had actually communicated was something Juno had found clarifying. Sungo held his gaze without expression. Juno continued. He said that he had spent 10 years building something that belonged to someone else in every room where it was discussed and attributed, and that he had accepted that arrangement because of Sujin and because he had believed, longer than the evidence warranted, that the relationship between them had some content beyond the transactional. The envelope at the funeral had resolved that question permanently. He said he was grateful for the clarity. He said he did not hold personal anger about it. But he said that selling the patent to Sungo was not something he intended to do, at any price, and that Sungo should instruct his legal team to begin examining the company's options under the terms of the notice. Sungo's expression did not change dramatically, but something behind it shifted. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. He said that if a negotiated resolution was not possible, he was prepared to pursue other means, and that Juno should be aware that certain narratives about his conduct during his tenure at the company could become relevant in a legal dispute. The implication was clear. Juno looked at the folded paper without touching it. Then he reached into his own jacket and placed a document on the table. It was a single printed page. Sungo picked it up and read it. The color left his face in a way that was gradual and then sudden, the way ice cracks, holding and then not holding. His hand remained steady, but the paper moved slightly, a small and involuntary tremor at the edge of his fingers. He set it down on the table between them. He did not speak for a long moment. The tea house was quiet around them. Outside the window an autumn leaf detached from a branch and turned slowly down toward the pavement. Juno picked up his cup and finished his tea. He said that he looked forward to hearing from Sungo's legal team and that he hoped the transition period would be used productively. He stood, bowed briefly, and left. Behind him Sungo remained seated at the low table, the document in front of him, alone in the quiet room with everything he had just understood. Juno had not seen Park Ji-hoon in years. Not the security guard at the front desk, but the other Park Ji-hoon, the one who shared a name with him by coincidence and who had spent most of his adult life being overlooked by the same man who had overlooked Juno, for different reasons and with different consequences. Sujin's younger brother was 30 years old. He had studied architecture at a university in Daejeon, graduated in the middle of his class, and returned to Seoul to find that his father had no particular role for him at PS Holdings and no particular interest in creating one. Sungo had built his company with a specific vision of succession in mind, and that vision did not include a son who had chosen a field with no direct application to industrial manufacturing and who had, in Sungo's estimation, demonstrated insufficient appetite for the operational discipline the company required. Ji-hoon had been told this in language that was only slightly less direct than a termination letter, and he had absorbed it with the particular kind of quiet that belongs to people who have been dismissed by someone important to them and have not yet decided what to do with the weight of it. He was working at a small architectural firm in Mapo when Juno received his message. The message came on a Thursday evening, 2 days after the tea house meeting, and it said simply, "I heard what happened at the funeral. I have things you need to see. Can we meet?" Juno had always maintained a careful distance from Ji-hoon, not out of dislike but out of the awareness that in a family structure as controlled as Sungo's, proximity between the son-in-law and the disregarded son carried its own complications. They had been cordial at family occasions and genuinely warm on the few evenings when Sujin had brought them together informally, and Juno had always found Ji-hoon straightforward in the way that people are straightforward when they have given up trying to manage other people's perceptions of them. He had no performance left. That quality, Juno thought, was worth more in the current situation than almost anything else. They met at Ji-hoon's apartment in Mapo, a small place on the third floor of a building that smelled of old wood and cooking from the restaurant below. Ji-hoon made instant coffee and set it on the table without apology and sat across from Juno with the directness of someone who had been waiting a long time to have this conversation. He began by saying that Sujin had spoken to him 6 months before she died. She had not told him everything, but she had told him enough, that their father intended to remove Juno from the company and that there were financial irregularities she had discovered that went beyond what she could resolve alone. She had asked Ji-hoon to pay attention. To watch the accounts he had access to as a minor shareholder, a position he held through his mother's estate and which Sungo had never been able to dissolve without triggering a legal dispute he preferred to avoid. Ji-hoon had done what his sister asked. He had been watching for 6 months. He opened his laptop and turned it toward Juno. The screen showed a series of transaction records pulled from the shareholder portal, the limited financial view that minor shareholders were entitled to access, and cross-referenced with public corporate registry documents that Ji-hoon had spent his evenings compiling with the methodical patience of someone trained to read technical drawings and find the lines that do not align. What he had found extended and clarified what Sujin had begun. The irregular transfers that Jae-won had identified in Sujin's documents were one part of the structure. What Ji-hoon had found was the destination. The private holding company that received the funds had made 3 property purchases in the past 4 years, 2 in Seoul and 1 in Jeju, all registered in the name of a person Juno did not recognize until Ji-hoon told him who it was. It was Bae Hyun-seok's wife's younger brother, a man with no professional connection to PS Holdings and no visible source of income that would account for the properties. The chain was not short, but it was traceable, and Ji-hoon had traced it with the care of someone who understood that the value of what he was building depended on every link being verifiable. Juno looked at the screen for a long time. He asked Ji-hoon why he was bringing this to him now, after 6 months of gathering it alone. Ji-hoon was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Sujin had asked him to wait until the right moment, and that she had told him he would know the moment when it came because their father would make it obvious. Ji-hoon said that handing a termination letter to his son-in-law at his daughter's funeral was, in his assessment, sufficiently obvious. His voice when he said this was level, but there was something underneath it that Juno recognized because he had felt it himself, a long-accumulated grief at the discovery that a person you needed to be one thing had always been another thing entirely. Juno said nothing for a moment. Then he told Ji-hoon about the patent. And about the documents from Jae-won. And about the meeting at the tea house 2 days ago. Ji-hoon listened without interrupting. When Juno finished, Ji-hoon closed his laptop and looked at him with an expression that was the closest thing to his sister's expression that Juno had ever seen on another face, that particular quality of clear-eyed assessment unclouded by wishful thinking. He said that their father had spent 40 years believing that the people around him were either assets or obstacles and that assets could be discarded when they were no longer needed. He said that their father had been wrong about that for a long time but had never been in a position where the wrongness had material consequences. He said that he thought it was time for that to change. Juno asked him directly whether he was willing to stand behind the documents he had compiled, formally and on record, if it came to that. Ji-hoon said yes without hesitation, the way people say yes when they have already made the decision long before the question was asked. Juno nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and found it had gone cold. He drank it anyway. Outside the window the Mapo streets were settling into their evening rhythm, ordinary and continuous, indifferent to the fact that the shape of something was changing in the small apartment above them. Before he left, Juno paused at the door and told Ji-hoon that Sujin had chosen well when she asked him to pay attention. Ji-hoon looked at him for a moment. He said that she had always known what she was doing. Juno said that he knew. He said goodnight and walked down the stairs into the street and stood for a moment in the cool air before beginning to walk toward the subway. Above him a single window was lit in the building, Ji-hoon's, and through it the faint blue light of a laptop screen was visible, still working, still building the careful record of everything that needed to be known. The extraordinary general meeting of PS Holdings shareholders was convened on a Tuesday morning in late November, 6 weeks after the funeral. It had been called at the request of 3 minority shareholders who together held a combined stake of 19% in the company, a threshold sufficient under the corporate articles to compel the chairman to schedule a general session within 30 days of the formal request. The 3 shareholders had submitted their request through a law firm that had no prior connection to PS Holdings. Their stated reason for calling the meeting was a review of executive compensation structures and related party transactions over the preceding 5 fiscal years. The language was technical and routine in its framing, and Sungo's legal team had reviewed it and advised him that while the meeting was an inconvenience, it was a manageable one. They had not yet understood who was behind the request or what would be brought into the room. Juno arrived at the PS Holdings building at 9:45, 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. He was not on the official attendee list. He did not need to be. As the holder of a patent license currently under formal dispute with the company, he had retained legal standing to be present at any shareholder session where matters touching on the company's intellectual property exposure were on the agenda, and his lawyer had submitted the relevant notification 3 days prior. The legal department had reviewed it and found no valid grounds for exclusion. When Juno walked through the lobby, the young security guard Park Ji-hoon, the one at the front desk, began to stand with the automatic courtesy he showed to familiar faces, then caught himself and glanced at his screen and looked uncertain. Juno nodded to him and walked to the elevator. On the 14th floor, the boardroom door was open and the directors were arranging themselves around the long dark table. When Juno entered the room, the quality of the air changed in the particular way it changes when something unexpected walks through a door. Several directors looked at him. Bae Hyun-seok, seated to Sung-go's right, stopped writing in his notepad. Sung-go himself was standing at the window with his back to the room and did not turn immediately. Juno took a seat along the side wall, not at the main table, the position appropriate to his legal status as an interested party rather than a director. He set his bag on the floor beside his chair and removed a stack of document folders and placed them on his knee and waited. Sung-go turned from the window and saw him, and for a single moment his composure showed its edges. It was brief and he recovered it quickly and took his seat at the head of the table and called the meeting to order in the same measured voice he had used in every meeting Juno had attended for a decade. The opening formalities proceeded. Attendance was confirmed. The agenda was read. Then the representative of the 3 requesting shareholders, a lawyer named Young Seo-yeon who was 35 years old and spoke with the precise economy of someone who was prepared very thoroughly, rose and said that before the formal agenda items were addressed she wished to distribute supplementary materials relevant to the related party transaction review. She nodded to her assistant. Juno stood at the same moment. He said, quietly, that he also had materials relevant to the proceedings and asked permission to distribute them to the directors present. Sung-go said his name in a tone that was the closest thing to a warning his controlled voice could produce. Juno looked at him briefly and then looked at the room and began moving along the table, placing a folder in front of each director with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this in his mind many times already and finds the physical version straightforward. He placed one in front of Bae Hyun-seok last, and he did not look at Hyun-seok's face when he set it down, but he heard the man's breathing change. He placed one in front of Sung-go and returned to his seat along the wall. The folders contained 3 sections. The first was the patent registration documents and the formal license termination notice and a legal analysis of PS Holdings' current intellectual property exposure, prepared by an independent IP law firm, which concluded that the company's primary product line was operationally dependent on the patented process and that continued production without a valid license agreement constituted infringement with a potential liability that the analysis quantified in a figure that occupied its own line. On the summary page. The second section was the financial documentation that Soo-jin had begun and Jae-won had supplemented and Ji-hoon had extended and cross-referenced, showing the pattern of irregular transfers, the receiving structure, and the property acquisitions that formed the end of the chain. The third section was a single document, a formal statement signed by Park Ji-hoon as a minority shareholder, attesting to the accuracy of the financial records he had compiled and requesting that the board commission an independent audit of the related party transactions identified in the materials. The directors read in silence. The room had the particular quality of silence that is not empty but full, packed with the sound of people absorbing things they cannot immediately respond to. Han Mayan, the youngest director, turned a page and stopped and turned it back and read something again. Choi Byung-grak had both hands flat on the table and was looking at a point somewhere beyond the document in front of him. Bae Hyun-seok put his folder down after the first section and did not pick it up again and sat with a stillness that was different from composure. Then Sung-go's voice came from the head of the table, tightly controlled, carrying the compressed force of a man who was not accustomed to the sensation of a room shifting away from him. He said that Juno had brought materials prepared without board authorization and that the related party allegations were without foundation and that this was an attempt to use grief and personal grievance to destabilize a company that Juno had never built and never owned. His voice was steady but the words were faster than usual, a fraction, and Juno heard it. He let the silence after Sung-go's statement sit for a moment. Then he said, without raising his voice, that Soo-jin had written in her letter that she was sorry she could not be there for the rest of it. He said that he had made her a promise, without words, standing at her desk in the quiet room where she used to work, that he would finish what she had started. He said he was keeping that promise today. He looked at Sungo directly. He said that everything in the folders had been prepared by people who loved this company and by one person who had loved Sungo's daughter, and that the board could do with it whatever they believed was correct. Then he sat back and folded his hands in his lap and waited. Across the table, the senior shareholder representative, a man named Oh Chang-soo, who had held his stake in PS Holdings for 12 years and who had said almost nothing in the first hour of the meeting, slowly closed his folder, pushed back his chair, and stood up. He looked at Sungo once. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and walked out of the room without speaking. The door closed behind him with a sound that was very ordinary and very final. The interview was published on a Friday morning, 3 days after the board meeting. It appeared on the website of a business news outlet that had covered PS Holdings favorably for years, the kind of publication that maintained warm relationships with established chairmen and understood implicitly that access and tone were connected. The piece was long and carefully constructed. Park Sungo sat in his office in the photographs, silver-haired and composed, and the journalist had captured him in the particular light that makes older men look like institutions rather than people. The headline read, "Chairman Park speaks out, family grief weaponized in corporate takeover attempt." The article described a bereaved father navigating the loss of his daughter while simultaneously defending the company he had built over 40 years from what it characterized as a calculated campaign by a former employee who had used intimate family access to position himself for a hostile acquisition. Sungo spoke about Soo-jin with a measured and rehearsed grief that read as genuine to anyone who did not know him. He said that his daughter would not have wanted her memory used this way. He said that Juno had always struggled to accept the boundaries of his role. He said the word boundaries twice. He did not make any claim that was technically false, which was the most dangerous kind of interview, the kind built from selected truths assembled into a shape that does not exist. By midday, the article had been shared widely in the business community. Juno's phone received messages from people he had not spoken to in years, some expressing concern, some asking careful questions designed to determine which side of the situation it was safer to align with, and a smaller number saying nothing useful at all. Lim Jae-won sent a message that said only, "I saw it." Ji-hun called and said that he was angry and asked what Juno wanted him to do. Juno told him to do nothing yet. Han Mayan, the youngest board director, sent a brief message saying that she wanted him to know she was thinking carefully about everything she had read in the folder and that she would be in touch. Juno thanked her and set the phone down. He sat at his kitchen table for a while and looked at the wall. He thought about what Sungo had done and why and whether it surprised him. It did not surprise him. A man who had spent 40 years controlling every room he entered would not simply absorb the loss of control without attempting to recapture the narrative. The interview was the move of someone who understood that public perception was a resource and that deploying it early, before the other side could shape the story, was tactically sound. It was a competent move. It was also, Juno thought, a move made by someone who did not fully understand what the other side was holding. The response he chose was the one that Soo-jin had made possible without knowing she was making it possible. He did not write a statement. He did not contact the journalist. He did not ask Ji-hun to speak publicly or instruct Jae-won to leak anything to anyone. He opened his phone and went to his personal social media account, which he had used perhaps a dozen times in the past 3 years and which had fewer than 300 followers, none of them significant. He photographed the 4th page of Soo-jin's letter, the final page, the one with her handwriting and the date and the last few lines she had written before she closed the envelope and put it in the drawer beneath the old map of Seoul. He did not crop the image. He did not add a caption. He posted it as it was, her handwriting, her words, the date 7 months before her death, the evidence of a woman who had known what was coming and had written about it clearly and with love and without self-pity. Then he put his phone face down on the table and made himself a bowl of instant noodles and ate them standing at the kitchen counter. By evening the post had been shared 40,000 times. By midnight it had passed 300,000. The comments were not the usual noise of online reaction, which tends toward heat and brevity. They were longer than usual, more considered, written by people who seemed to have read the letter carefully and were responding to its specific content rather than its symbolic value. People wrote about their own fathers. About companies and families and the particular damage done by men who treat the people closest to them as instruments of their ambitions. Some people who claimed to have known Soo-jin professionally wrote about what she had been like, her directness and her fairness in the way she had run meetings without wasting anyone's time. A former supplier wrote that she had personally intervened to ensure his small company was paid on time during the 2018 crisis when the accounts department had deprioritized smaller vendors, and that she had done it without being asked and without mentioning it afterward. The post grew through the night without Juno touching it. Ji-hun called again at 11 and his voice was different from the afternoon call, quieter and less angry and carrying something that sounded like it had moved past grief into something more settled. He said that people were understanding who she was. Juno said that people were understanding who she had always been and that it had simply taken the right moment for it to become visible. He said goodnight to Ji-hun and went to bed. In the morning, the outlet that had published Sungdo's interview quietly amended the headline online to remove the word takeover, citing editorial review. The journalist did not respond to the 3 messages Juno had not sent. Sungdo's office issued no further statement. Bae Hyun-seok submitted a letter of resignation from the chief financial officer position citing personal health reasons, which no one in the building found convincing but which everyone found convenient. 3 of the 5 directors who had been at the board meeting requested an emergency session to discuss the commissioning of an independent audit, which was the procedurally correct response to the materials they had received and which meant that the process Soo-jin had begun from her desk in the quiet room with the yellowing plant was now moving through the official structure of the institution, properly and irreversibly, the way things move when they have been built carefully enough. Juno read the meeting notification on his phone while standing at the window of his apartment in the early morning light. Below on the street, a woman was walking a small dog. A delivery truck was backing slowly into position. Everything was ordinary and continuous. He looked at the notification for a moment longer and then put the phone in his pocket and went to make coffee. There was one part left. He intended to do it correctly. 6 months passed the way the months after difficult things tend to pass, not quickly and not slowly but with the particular texture of time that has been filled with work rather than waiting. The independent audit was completed in February. Its findings confirmed and extended what Soo-jin's documents had indicated, a pattern of related party transactions spanning 7 years, totaling an amount that the auditors described in their report with the careful neutral language of professionals who understand that numbers of that size require understatement to be taken seriously. Bae Hyun-seok was referred to the prosecutor's office in March. His lawyer issued a statement saying his client would cooperate fully, which was the statement lawyers issue when cooperation is the only remaining option. Park Sung-do was not named in the criminal referral. The transfers had been structured with enough distance between his signature and the transactions to make direct criminal liability difficult to establish, which Juno had understood from the beginning was likely to be the case. But the civil exposure was substantial, and the damage to his standing among the shareholder community was the kind that does not repair itself regardless of what statements are issued or what dinners are attended. The 3 minority shareholders who had called the extraordinary meeting sold their combined stake in April to a consortium of investors whose representative Juno had met twice in the preceding months, in conversations that were exploratory and then specific and then final. He acquired his own stake through a separate process, purchasing shares from 4 individual shareholders who had decided independently that the company's future was clearer with new leadership than without it. He did not force anyone's hand. He did not need to. The audit had done that work more thoroughly than pressure could have. The legal formalization of the new ownership structure was completed on a Wednesday morning in late April. Juno was in his lawyer's office for 3 hours signing documents and initialing pages and confirming details that his lawyer read aloud with the methodical care of someone who understands that the value of a document is in its precision. Ji-hun was there as well, in his capacity as a minority shareholder whose stake was being consolidated into the new structure, and as the newly appointed director of development, a role they had discussed at length over several evenings in the Mapo apartment and which suited him in the way that roles suit people when they have been chosen based on what a person actually is rather than what an institution needs them to represent. When the signing was finished, the lawyers shook their hands and his assistant brought tea and they sat for a moment in the office before going their separate ways into the afternoon. The signage on the building was changed on a Friday. Juno had not planned to be there for it. He had arranged the practical details, the new company name, the design, the installation schedule, and he had intended to let it happen without making it into an occasion, because he was not interested in occasions and had never been the kind of person who required visible markers to understand when something had changed. But Jaewon had sent him a message the evening before saying simply, "You should be there," and Juno had thought about it and decided that Jaewon was correct, not for his own sake but because there were people who had worked in that building for years who deserved to see that the change was real and present and not merely administrative. So he was standing on the pavement across the street when the crew removed the old lettering from the facade and fitted the new panels into place. The morning was clear and cold, a Friday in late April with the particular brightness that comes after rain, and the light on the building's glass front made everything sharp and distinct. The new name on the facade was clean and simple. He had chosen it without drama. It was not his family name. It was the name of the process optimization system, abbreviated, the thing he had built in the margins of other people's credit and registered quietly through a lawyer in a building 3 blocks away 8 years ago on a night when the cleaners were moving through the corridor with their carts and nobody was watching. It seemed right that the thing which had been the foundation of everything should finally be visible on the outside of the building that it had always been holding up from within. Jaewon was standing beside him on the pavement. They watched the installation crew make the final adjustments and step back. Jaewon said that it looked correct. Juno agreed that it did. They stood there for another minute without speaking, which was comfortable in the way that silences are comfortable between people who have been through something together and do not need to describe it to each other. Then Jaewon said he had a 10 o'clock meeting and went inside. Juno stayed a moment longer. He thought about Sungdo, who was living in the family estate in Songbukdong and who had, through his lawyers, received the settlement terms Juno had instructed his own lawyers to prepare, terms that ensured the older man had sufficient income in the house he had lived in for 30 years and access to medical care without financial difficulty. Juno had insisted on this over the mild objection of his legal team, who felt it was more generous than the circumstances required. He had told them that the circumstances were not the point. The point was that Sujin had loved her father despite everything, in the complicated and unresolved way that people love parents who have disappointed them, and that honoring her memory meant not destroying the man entirely, even if the man had never extended the same consideration to anyone around him. It was not forgiveness. It was something more practical than forgiveness. It was the decision of a person who intends to live well and understands that carrying unnecessary weight makes that harder. He crossed the street and walked through the front doors of the building. The lobby security guard, young Park Ji-hoon, the one who had always greeted him with particular cheerfulness, looked up and smiled and said good morning with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who had never needed to calculate whether it was safe to be warm. Juno greeted him by name and took the elevator to the 14th floor. His office was the one at the end of the corridor with the windows facing the Han River. He had not changed the furniture. The long desk and the shelves and the chair were the same as they had always been. He had added one thing. On the windowsill, beside the glass that held the morning light, was a small potted plant, the same variety that Sujin had kept on her shelf in the quiet room at home, the kind she had never been able to keep alive longer than 3 months before replacing it with an identical one. He had repotted this one carefully and placed it where it would get the right amount of light, and he had been watering it precisely and it was doing well. He sat down at the desk and opened his laptop and looked at the morning's messages and began to work. Outside the window the Han River moved in the early light, wide and continuous and indifferent to everything except its own direction. On the windowsill the plant was green and steady. She had known what she was doing. She had always known. That was the last thing and the first thing and the only thing that had ever needed to be true.